My name is Calvin Hayes. I am 62 years old, and for 40 years I woke up long before the sun ever thought about rising. I spent 4 decades working as a master electrician pulling high-voltage wire through the bones of this city. I spent my life with the smell of copper and ozone on my clothes, and grease permanently worked into the calluses on my hands. I worked double shifts and weekends so my family would never know what it means to look at an empty pantry or shiver in a cold house. I built a solid, honest life with my bare hands. They say money cannot buy class, but I learned the hard way that it can definitely rent a whole lot of arrogance. When my daughter came home crying in the pouring rain, I learned her husband had called her a desperate cow in front of his entire wealthy family. He thought she was helpless and alone. He forgot one tiny detail. The $4,600 monthly lifeline, keeping his fancy business alive, came straight from my bank account, and I could end it with a single phone call. It was Thanksgiving Eve. The weather outside was downright miserable. It was the kind of night where the sky just opens up and tries to wash the entire world away. A freezing, heavy rain was coming down in thick sheets hammering against the roof and windows of my house. I was standing in my warm kitchen, wiping down the granite counters and getting the turkey prepped for the oven the next morning. I had the radio playing some old soul music low in the background. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful night for me. My daughter Chloe, who is 32 years old, was supposed to be across town at her in-laws' massive estate for their grand, traditional holiday dinner. The Sterling family always did things big. They had the generational wealth, the country club memberships, and the kind of status that makes people think they can walk on water. I was just the blue-collar dad who paid his dues, kept to himself, and stayed out of their way. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and glanced at the wall clock. It was just past 9 in the evening. The house was quiet, except for the howling storm outside. Then the doorbell rang. It was not a normal, polite ring. It was frantic and desperate, like someone was leaning their entire body weight against the button. I walked to the front door, feeling a sudden sharp tightness in my chest. If you are a parent, you know exactly what I am talking about. It is that deep instinctual feeling that tells you something is terribly wrong with your child. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The freezing wind whipped rain right into my foyer, but I did not even notice the cold. Standing there on my porch, soaking wet and shivering uncontrollably, was my daughter Chloe. She was holding my 2-year-old grandson Leo tightly against her chest, trying to shield him from the bitter wind. Leo had his little face buried deep in her neck, crying softly. Chloe was completely drenched. Her elegant dinner dress was clinging to her body, and her hair was plastered to her cheeks. But it was not the rain that broke my heart into pieces. It was the look in her eyes. It was a look of absolute, total defeat. I immediately reached out and pulled them both inside quickly, slamming the heavy wooden door shut against the storm. Chloe could not even speak at first. Her teeth were chattering so hard, and she was shaking so violently she could barely keep her grip on the boy. I took Leo gently from her arms. He felt so small and cold. I told her to take off her ruined coat while I hurried to the hall bathroom to grab the thickest, warmest towels I owned. I wrapped a big dry towel around Leo and rubbed his little back to get the terrible chill out of his bones. Then I wrapped another large towel around my daughter's shoulders. I led them into the living room and sat them down on the comfortable sofa right next to the hot radiator. I did not push her with 100 questions right away. I am an older man, and I have lived long enough to know that when a human soul is in deep pain, you have to let it breathe first. I went into the kitchen, warmed up some milk for my grandson, and poured a steaming cup of chamomile tea for my daughter. As I sat in the armchair across from her, watching her take slow, trembling sips of that tea, my mind went back over the years. I raised Chloe to be a strong, intelligent, and kind woman. After her mother passed away, I worked myself to the bone. I took every dangerous overtime job I could get my hands on. I wanted Chloe to have the absolute best education, so she would never feel like she was lacking anything in this world. She grew up to be a beautiful, smart woman with a heart of pure gold. She used to be a dedicated school teacher before she had Leo. She loved helping children. Then she met Preston Sterling. Preston was 35 years old, a white man from a family that had old money and a whole lot of unearned pride. He ran what he called a boutique marketing agency downtown. He drove a flashy imported sports car, wore custom-tailored suits, and spoke like a man who believed he owned the very ground he walked on. I never quite liked the way he looked at my rough, calloused hands, or the way he subtly talked down to me, but I kept my mouth shut because Chloe loved him deeply. I wanted my daughter to be happy. I wanted her to have a beautiful family. I thought I was investing in her long-term happiness. Slowly, the violent shaking stopped. Chloe looked up at me and her eyes were red and swollen from crying all the way over here. She took a deep, shaky breath, and the ugly truth started to spill out. She told me about the dinner at the Sterling family mansion. It was a formal, lavish affair. Preston's whole family was sitting around a massive mahogany table. His parents, his cousins, and his older sister, Audrey. Audrey is 38 years old, and she has always looked down her nose at Chloe. Audrey is the kind of elitist woman who truly believes that wearing a designer label and going to expensive Pilates classes makes her a superior human being. She never missed a chance to make sly, passive-aggressive comments about Chloe's modest background, or the fact that Chloe chose to be a stay-at-home mother instead of climbing some corporate ladder. Chloe said the dinner started off incredibly tense. Audrey was drinking heavy amounts of expensive wine and making cruel jokes entirely at Chloe's expense. Audrey started by commenting on Chloe's clothes, saying her dress looked like it came from a cheap discount rack, and wondering aloud if Chloe even knew what a tailor was. Then she viciously went after Chloe's weight. Chloe had put on a few normal pounds after having Leo, just like any healthy mother does. Audrey laughed a high-pitched, mocking laugh and told the whole table that Chloe really needed to lay off the carbohydrates if she ever wanted to truly fit into high society. Chloe said she felt her face burning with intense shame. She looked across the table at Preston. She was desperately waiting for her husband to defend her. She was waiting for the man who stood at an altar and promised to love and protect her to stand up and tell his snobby sister to show some basic human respect. Instead, Preston just laughed along with them. He actually raised his glass of premium scotch, took a leisurely sip, and looked right at his own wife with pure disdain. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably now as she told me this part. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard her knuckles turned white. She told me that Preston laughed at her in front of all of them. He told Audrey not to be too hard on her. He said she was just a desperate cow who was lucky he even brought her to the table. He said those exact words right in front of his parents, right in front of everyone. And the entire table just laughed at her like she was a piece of trash. Hearing those vile words, I felt a sharp physical pain radiate through my chest. A desperate cow. My daughter. My beautiful, smart, loving daughter who gave up her teaching career to raise his son, who supported him unconditionally when his fancy business was struggling to get off the ground. He called her that disgusting name just to amuse his arrogant sister. I felt a massive fire ignite deep in my belly. It was not a loud, explosive fire. It was a quiet, steady, dark burn. The kind of intense fire that melts solid steel. I looked at little Leo, who had finally fallen asleep on the sofa, wrapped warmly in the towel. He was completely innocent in all of this. He did not know that his father was a cruel, arrogant coward who treated his mother like dirt for the entertainment of rich snobs. Chloe told me that after he said that, she just froze in her chair. She felt so incredibly humiliated she could not even draw a breath. She quietly stood up, grabbed Leo from his wooden high chair, and walked straight out of the grand dining room. Preston did not even try to get up to stop her. He did not apologize. He just yelled after her to make sure she took a taxi, because he was absolutely not going to drive her home and ruin his holiday evening. She walked right out into the freezing, pouring rain carrying her baby and managed to get a rideshare straight to my house. She had nowhere else in the world to go. She felt completely broken and discarded. She told me through her tears that she felt like she had failed as a wife, like she was completely worthless. I reached out and gently wiped the cold tears from her cheeks with my rough thumbs. I looked her dead in the eyes, and I spoke to her with a voice thick with emotion, but absolute and firm in its conviction. I told her she was not worthless. I reminded her that she is a Hayes. I told her she comes from good, strong, hard-working stock. I told her she is a wonderful, dedicated mother and a beautiful, resilient woman. I strictly commanded her to never ever let a weak man who wears a borrowed crown tell her that she is not royalty. I hugged her tightly against my chest, letting her cry all her pain onto my shoulder. I rubbed her back steadily and promised her that everything was going to be perfectly all right. I assured her that she and Leo were completely safe here in my home, and they could stay as long as they ever needed to. But while I was holding my daughter and comforting her shattered heart, my mind was already shifting into a completely different gear. I was silently doing the math. Preston clearly thought he held all the cards in this relationship. He thought because he wore expensive Italian suits and came from a family with a massive estate that he was utterly untouchable. He assumed Chloe was just a poor girl with a simple blue-collar father who could not possibly do anything to stop him. He thought she had zero power and zero financial backing. But Preston Sterling was a miserable fool who suffered from a very convenient and very short memory. In his drunken arrogance, he forgot one vital piece of information. That flashy boutique marketing agency he constantly bragged about to all his high society friends. That gorgeous downtown office with the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the modern art, and the expensive imported espresso machines. The very place that made him look like a highly successful, dominant businessman. He could not actually afford a single square foot of it. A year ago, when his disorganized business was rapidly failing, and he was literally days away from being evicted by the building management, he came crying to my house. He swallowed his massive pride and begged me for financial help. And because I loved my daughter more than life itself and wanted her growing family to have a stable, secure life, I stepped in. I quietly signed my name on the dotted line as the primary financial guarantor for his commercial lease. Every single month without fail, my bank account automatically transferred $4,600 directly to his commercial landlord, just to keep the lights on and his polished doors open. I was the silent, invisible foundation holding up his entire fake empire. I sat there, in my quiet living room, listening to the heavy rain beat mercilessly against the windows and the soft, steady breathing of my sleeping grandson. I stroked my daughter's hair as she finally began to calm down from sheer physical exhaustion. Preston thought he could treat my flesh and blood like absolute garbage and get away with it without a scratch. He actually believed his family money and his social status shielded him from any real consequences. But he was about to learn a very hard, very painful lesson about respect and reality. Tomorrow morning, I was not going to drive over there and yell at him. I was not going to send an angry, threatening text message. I was going to make one simple, quiet phone call to a commercial real estate broker. I was going to cut that $4,600 lifeline right down the middle and let him drown. I made a silent, ironclad promise to myself right then and there. By the time I was finished with him, Preston Sterling would know exactly what it feels like to have absolutely nothing. The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds just past 6 o'clock, but I had not slept a single wink. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear into the cool morning air. From down the hall, I could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of my daughter Chloe and my little grandson Leo. They were completely exhausted from the tears and the heartbreak of the night before. I just sat there in the quiet house, letting the deep anger from last night settle into a cold, hard focus. In my 40 years of pulling high-voltage wire across this city, I learned that reckless energy gets you killed. You have to ground yourself. You have to respect the power you are working with. Preston Sterling thought he had all the power. He thought his expensive suits and his country club pedigree made him untouchable. He assumed he could humiliate my daughter and face zero consequences because we did not have a famous last name. But he was about to learn that real power does not come from a trust fund. Real power comes from the man who controls the current. At exactly 8 in the morning, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number for the commercial real estate management company that owned Preston's fancy downtown office building. I knew the property manager well. He was a strict, no-nonsense businessman named Richard, who handled all the premium leases in the financial district. When Richard picked up the line, I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I was officially revoking my status as the financial guarantor for the boutique marketing agency on the 14th floor. I informed him that my bank would no longer be authorizing the automatic monthly transfer of $4,600. Richard was quiet for a moment. He knew exactly how much that commercial lease cost, and he knew Preston was consistently late on payments before I quietly stepped in to save his reputation. Richard cleared his throat and asked me if I was absolutely certain about this decision. He warned me that without my financial backing, the agency lease would be in severe default by noon today. I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I thanked him for his time, hung up the phone, and immediately opened my banking app. With a few deliberate taps on the screen, I permanently deleted the recurring payment authorization. Just like that, the massive financial lifeline that kept Preston's fake corporate empire afloat was completely dead. I set the phone face down on the table, took another sip of my dark coffee, and waited. I knew it would not take very long for the shockwave to hit downtown. It took exactly 3 hours. At 11 in the morning, my phone started vibrating aggressively against the kitchen counter. The caller identification flashed Preston's name in bright letters. I let it ring 4 times before I calmly picked up the device and brought it to my ear. I did not say a single word. I just sat there and listened to the sound of him breathing heavily on the other end. Preston was absolutely furious. His voice was completely out of control, loud and high-pitched with pure panic. He demanded to know exactly what was going on with the lease payment. He said the property manager had just walked straight into his office right in front of his entire staff and handed him an official notice of default. Preston screamed at me over the receiver, asking how I could be so incredibly irresponsible and forget to make the scheduled transfer. He actually had the nerve to sound like a disappointed boss reprimanding a lazy employee. I let him yell until his voice cracked and he ran out of breath. I wanted to hear the true desperation in his tone. Then I spoke with a quiet, steady voice that carried absolutely zero emotion. I told him that I did not forget anything. I told him I canceled the payment on purpose. Preston was stunned into absolute silence for a fraction of a second before his ego took over and he demanded a proper explanation. I pictured him standing in his glass corner office, wearing his expensive Italian shoes, sweating through his designer shirt. Then I delivered the exact words I had been practicing all morning. I told him plainly that cows do not pay for premium downtown real estate. The silence on the line was so incredibly thick, you could have cut it with a knife. Preston instantly knew exactly what I meant. He realized that Chloe had come straight to my house and told me all about the vile insult he threw at her in front of his snobby sister Audrey. But instead of feeling an ounce of genuine shame or offering a sincere apology, Preston showed me exactly what kind of monster he truly was. The thin, polite veneer of the respectful son-in-law completely vanished in an instant. His voice dropped into a nasty, vicious sneer. He told me that I had no right to pull his business funding over a simple, harmless family joke. Then he decided to attack my pride. He told me I was nothing but a glorified handyman, with dirt permanently stuck under his fingernails. He proudly declared that he was a sterling and that his family was practically royalty in this city, while I was just a tired old man who peaked working manual labor. He said I should be begging on my hands and knees, thanking him for giving my simple daughter a fraction of his high society lifestyle. I did not raise my voice or take his bait. I simply told him that royalty usually pays their own bills without asking for charity from a handyman. Then I hung up the phone right in his face. I knew a proud, arrogant man like Preston would not just take a massive hit to his ego and walk away quietly. A cornered animal always lashes out, and Preston was the worst kind of coward. He was the kind of man who attacked the vulnerable when he felt his own pride slipping away. Less than 20 minutes after I hung up the phone, Chloe walked into the kitchen carrying little Leo on her hip. She looked completely exhausted, her beautiful face pale and deeply drawn from crying. Before I could even pour her a comforting cup of coffee, her cell phone chimed loudly. Then it chimed again and again. A rapid, aggressive series of frantic notifications began echoing through my quiet kitchen. Chloe set Leo down in his wooden high chair and pulled her phone from her sweater pocket. I watched all the blood drain entirely from her face. Her hands started trembling so violently she almost dropped the device on the tile floor. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes and told me that her bank accounts were completely empty. Preston had maliciously logged into their joint checking and savings accounts and drained every single penny they had. He transferred all the marital funds to a private offshore account solely in his name. The money they had diligently saved for Leo's future, the monthly grocery budget, the emergency health funds, it was all entirely gone. Chloe was in a state of absolute shock. She quickly tried to log into her credit card portal, but the passwords had already been changed. Preston had effectively cut off her entire financial existence in a matter of minutes. He wanted to punish her for coming to me for protection. He wanted to leave her completely destitute and begging for his mercy. Pure panic truly set in when Chloe realized that all of Leo's important documents were still back at the suburban house she shared with Preston. She desperately needed Leo's birth certificate, his social security card, and his prescription asthma medication, which was securely locked in the nursery cabinet. She started crying uncontrollably, telling me that she had to go back there immediately to get her baby's things before Preston did something even worse to their home. I told her I would not let her go back to that house alone under any circumstances. I grabbed my truck keys, helped her bundle Leo into his warm winter coat, and safely strapped him into his car seat in the back of my vehicle. We drove across town to the upscale, gated community where Preston and Chloe lived. The drive felt like it took hours. The whole way there, Chloe was nervously wringing her hands, terrified of what we might find waiting for us. When we pulled up to the sprawling modern house with its perfectly manicured lawn and massive oak doors, my instincts immediately told me something was terribly wrong. The wide driveway was completely empty, but the security panel by the front door was flashing a solid, bright red light. Chloe ran up the concrete front steps and quickly punched her personal code into the electronic keypad. The system beeped loudly and flashed a harsh access denied warning on the digital screen. She frantically tried her physical key in the heavy deadbolt, but the metal cylinder would not even turn. The brass lock mechanism had been completely swapped out. Preston had called an emergency locksmith the very moment I hung up the phone on him. He had officially and illegally locked his own wife and his 2-year-old son out of their own home. Chloe began to pound frantically on the heavy wooden door with both fists. She called out Preston's name, begging him through her tears to just let her get her son's medical supplies and clothes. There was absolutely no answer from inside. The large house stood there cold and silent, refusing to let her inside. I stood on the walkway and watched my beautiful daughter break down, crying on the expensive welcome mat. She felt completely powerless against the vast resources and the cruel, vindictive nature of the Sterling family. She turned to me sobbing heavily, saying that Preston had finally won. She said he had ruthlessly taken her money, her home, and her dignity, and she had absolutely no legal or financial way to fight back against a man who held all the keys. I walked slowly up those concrete steps and placed my heavy, calloused hands firmly on her shaking shoulders. I told her to wipe her tears and stand up straight. I reminded her once again that she was the daughter of Calvin Hayes, and we do not ever beg outside closed doors. I looked past her shoulder at the massive, beautiful house. Preston thought he was so incredibly smart, changing the locks and resetting the digital security codes from his downtown office. He thought he had built an impenetrable high-tech fortress to keep his wife out in the cold. But Preston forgot something else in his blind rage, something far more important than a canceled lease payment. 3 years ago, when they first bought this expensive property, it was a total disaster on the inside. The wiring was outdated and highly dangerous. Preston did not want to pay the exorbitant union fees to have the massive house rewired to modern safety standards. So he smiled his fake, charming smile and asked his blue-collar father-in-law to do the massive job for free as a generous wedding gift. I spent 3 grueling weeks crawling through the hot attic, the damp basement, and the tight crawl spaces of that exact house. I pulled every single foot of copper wire myself. I installed every junction box. I mapped out the entire electrical security grid and personally connected the smart locks to the main hidden breaker panel in the garage. I knew the complex electrical blueprints of that suburban house better than the back of my own hand, because I designed every inch of them. I looked at my crying daughter and gave her a calm, reassuring smile. I told her to take little Leo back to the truck and wait where it was safe and warm. I told her that an arrogant man can change all the physical locks in the world, but a lock is just a dumb piece of metal controlled by an electric current. And I am the master who commands the current. Preston Sterling had officially started a war by draining her accounts and locking an innocent child out of his rightful home. But he had absolutely no idea the kind of destructive fire he just invited to his front door. The battle line was firmly drawn in the concrete, and I was about to show that arrogant boy exactly what a glorified handyman can do when you mess with his family. The real war had just begun. The heavy rain from the night before had finally cleared, leaving a cold, damp chill hanging in the Georgia air. I kissed my daughter on the forehead, told her to keep little Leo safe in the spare bedroom, and walked out to my truck. My heavy leather tool bag was sitting in the passenger seat, right where it has always been for the last 40 years. Preston Sterling thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess by changing the physical locks on his fancy front doors. He thought a piece of brass and a new digital keypad could keep a father from protecting his flesh and blood. But men like Preston do not understand how the real world operates. They pay people like me to build their fortresses, and they completely forget that the architect always knows where the secret doors are hidden. I drove through the winding, affluent streets of the northern suburbs. The massive oak trees cast long, dark shadows over the wet pavement. I was not rushing. I drove the speed limit, keeping my breathing steady and my mind absolutely sharp. Anger is a hot flame that burns out quickly, but what I felt right then was a cold, creeping frost. I pulled up about a block away from their sprawling modern estate. It was 10:30 in the morning. I knew Preston was sitting in his leased downtown office fuming over the canceled payments and trying to figure out how to save his fake image. I grabbed my tool bag and walked quietly up the manicured sidewalk toward the wrought iron security gate that surrounded the property. This gate was top-of-the-line imported steel with a biometric camera and a magnetic lock that required a specialized key fob. Preston had bragged about how much it cost him when he first bought the place. What he failed to mention to his country club friends was that his blue-collar father-in-law had spent 2 back-breaking days wiring the main control board because he was too cheap to hire a union crew. I did not even glance at the flashing camera lens. I walked straight to a small decorative stone planter hidden behind a row of thick hydrangeas. I knelt in the wet dirt and carefully pulled the faux stone aside to reveal the heavy weatherproof junction box I had installed 3 years ago. I unzipped my leather bag and pulled out my digital multimeter and a pair of insulated wire strippers. My hands remembered the exact layout of the circuits. I sliced through the thick rubber casing of the primary relay, bypassing the main alarm trigger with a simple copper jumper wire. The system thought it was still running perfectly normal. With one quick twist of my wrist, I severed the current to the magnetic lock. A soft metallic click echoed in the quiet morning air. The heavy iron gate swung open effortlessly. I walked up the long paved driveway and approached the front door. The new digital keypad glowed a bright, intimidating blue. Preston had proudly changed the code, locking his wife and baby out in the cold. I did not bother trying to guess his new password. I knelt beside the door frame and removed the baseboard panel with a flathead screwdriver. I found the low-voltage power line feeding the smart lock. I clamped my testing meter onto the wire, sent a brief reverse surge through the circuit, and completely scrambled the internal motherboard. The blue light flickered once and died. The deadbolt slid back with a heavy thud. I turned the handle and walked right into my daughter's house. The silence inside the house was thick and suffocating. It smelled of expensive leather and that sharp citrus cologne Preston constantly bathed himself in. I did not waste a single second standing around. I walked straight upstairs to the master bedroom and then over to the nursery. I grabbed a large, sturdy duffel bag from the closet and started packing with methodical precision. I packed Leo's warm clothes, his favorite stuffed bear, his asthma inhaler, and the specialized medical documents my daughter had been begging for. I went into Chloe's vanity and retrieved her passport, her social security card, and the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her late mother. I packed everything tight, making sure my daughter and my grandson would never have to rely on that man for their basic existence ever again. As I zipped up the heavy duffel bag and slung it over my broad shoulder, I walked back downstairs toward the kitchen. I planned to leave immediately, but as I passed the massive marble kitchen island, something caught my eye. There was a sleek silver laptop sitting open on the counter. It was not Chloe's computer, and it definitely was not the bulky corporate machine Preston used for his marketing agency. It was a brand new, ridiculously expensive model. The screen was dark, but sitting right next to the keyboard was a thick, folded piece of premium cardstock. It looked like a receipt from a high-end jeweler. I set the duffel bag down on the floor and picked up the paper. I unfolded it and felt my jaw clench tight. The receipt was dated just 3 days ago. It was from an exclusive diamond boutique in Buckhead. The total purchase price was $15,000 paid in full. The item description read, custom platinum pendant with diamond clusters. My blood began to boil. Chloe did not own a necklace like that. She had worn the same simple gold chain I bought her for her high school graduation for the last 10 years. Preston had locked my daughter out of her home and drained her bank accounts, claiming they were completely broke, while secretly dropping $15,000 on jewelry for someone else. I stared at the receipt, and then at the strange silver laptop. A dark, ugly truth was beginning to materialize right in front of me. This was not just about a cruel, arrogant husband trying to punish his wife. There was a massive underlying secret hiding in the shadows of this marriage, and I was going to drag it out into the blinding light of day. I carefully folded the receipt exactly the way I had found it, and placed it right back next to the silver laptop. My immediate instinct was to take a picture of it, but I stopped myself. A photograph of a piece of paper is a good starting point, but it is not a killing blow in a court of law. A man like Preston would just lie. He would hire an expensive lawyer to claim he bought the necklace as an apology gift for Chloe, or that it was a prop for one of his ridiculous marketing campaigns. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of his true intentions. I needed to see exactly what he was doing when he thought no one in the world was watching. I walked slowly into the sprawling living room. The ceiling was vaulted with massive wooden beams and huge decorative wall sconces, casting a soft, warm glow against the custom paint. I looked at the main sconce mounted high on the wall directly facing the center of the living room and the kitchen entryway. It was perfectly positioned to capture every single word spoken and every single action taken in the main living space. I smiled grimly. Preston loved those expensive lights. He had demanded I install them myself because he did not trust regular contractors to handle his imported fixtures. I knew the wiring behind that specific sconce intimately. I walked out to my truck and opened my secure lockbox hidden under the passenger seat. Inside was a tiny, discreet micro camera no bigger than a single button on a dress shirt. It was motion-activated, equipped with a high-definition wide-angle lens, and had a built-in cellular transmitter that streamed encrypted video directly to a secure server. I use these occasionally to monitor my hardware store inventory, but today, this little piece of technology was going to serve a much higher purpose. I grabbed my folding aluminum ladder from the truck bed, carried it inside, and set it up firmly beneath the wall sconce. I climbed up and carefully unscrewed the ornate bronze faceplate. The electrical cavity behind the wall was spacious. I pulled out my wire snips and carefully spliced into the main copper power line feeding the lighting circuit. I did not want to rely on a cheap internal battery that would inevitably die in a few days. I hardwired the tiny camera directly into the house's permanent electrical grid, connecting the positive and neutral terminals with absolute precision. The camera would draw a constant, invisible trickle of power from the house itself. It would literally run forever until I decided to take it down. I tucked the small transmitter block deep inside the drywall cavity out of sight, and threaded the microscopic lens directly through a tiny decorative ventilation hole in the bronze fixture. Unless someone climbed a ladder with a magnifying glass and knew exactly what they were looking for, the camera was completely invisible. I pulled out my cell phone, synced the internal transmission frequency, and watched the high-definition color feed pop up instantly on my screen. The angle was absolutely flawless. I could see the entire living room, the expensive leather sofas, the marble kitchen island, and the front hallway. I securely screwed the bronze faceplate back onto the wall, wiped away any trace of drywall dust with my handkerchief, and folded up my ladder. I had effectively turned Preston's personal sanctuary into a live broadcasting studio, and he was completely oblivious. I grabbed the heavy duffel bag full of my grandson's belongings and walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me. I reattached the baseboard panel, leaving the digital keypad looking perfectly normal, but functionally dead. I walked down the long driveway, closed the heavy iron gate, and reconnected the hidden junction box, restoring the alarm system to its normal state. I left no footprints, no broken glass, and absolutely no sign that a father had just breached an impenetrable fortress to protect his child. I drove back to my house feeling a strange mix of deep exhaustion and sharp anticipation. When I walked through my front door, Chloe was sitting on the floor of the living room building, a small tower out of wooden blocks with little Leo. When she saw the duffel bag, her eyes flooded with fresh tears. She stood up and wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, thanking me over and over again. I held her close, told her everything was going to be fine, and handed her the bag. I did not mention the $15,000 receipt or the hidden camera. She was already carrying far too much pain on her fragile shoulders. I needed to shoulder this heavy burden myself until the time was absolutely right. The hours dragged on slowly, as the evening slowly turned into a dark, starless night. I fed Leo dinner, helped Chloe get him settled into the spare bedroom, and finally sat down alone in my quiet kitchen. The house was completely silent. It was past 10 o'clock. I poured myself a tall glass of cold water, sat in my wooden chair, and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over the security application for a long moment. I expected to open the live feed and see Preston pacing around the living room in a blind rage, drinking his expensive scotch and screaming at his lawyers over the phone because his lease payment had bounced. I expected to see a man furious that his financial world was crumbling. I tapped the screen, and the live video stream buffered for a brief second before snapping into crystal clear focus. The motion sensor had just been triggered. The heavy front door swung open, and Preston walked into the grand hallway. But he was not alone. He was not screaming on his cell phone, and he did not look angry at all. He looked completely relaxed, and he was laughing softly. Following closely behind him, wearing a stunning designer dress and a $15,000 custom platinum diamond necklace, was a woman. I recognized her instantly. It was Savannah. She was the wealthy high society socialite who was supposed to be the lifelong best friend of Preston's arrogant sister Audrey. Preston closed the heavy door, leaned against the expensive wood, and pulled Savannah roughly by the waist. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and they began kissing passionately right there in the middle of the foyer, laughing and whispering to each other, as if they did not have a single care in the entire world. My daughter was sleeping on a borrowed mattress in my spare room with a completely drained bank account and a broken heart, while her husband was parading his wealthy mistress through the house I wired. I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The burning anger inside my chest hardened into absolute solid ice. This was not a simple domestic dispute anymore. Preston Sterling was playing a very dangerous game of deception, and he thought he was holding a royal flush. But he had no idea that I was dealing the cards, and I was about to fold his entire fake empire right in half. I sat there in the shadows of my kitchen, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles physically ached. Through the tiny speaker, I could hear the sharp clinking of heavy crystal glasses and the smooth sound of premium liquor being poured. The microscopic camera I had wired into that wall sconce was working perfectly, picking up every single breath and every arrogant chuckle echoing through that massive living room. I watched the bright screen as Preston handed a glass of expensive scotch to Savannah. She draped her arms around his neck, her custom platinum necklace catching the warm light of the room. It was the exact same $15,000 diamond necklace from the receipt I had found on the kitchen island earlier that afternoon. My stomach turned over with disgust. This woman was supposed to be the lifelong trusted best friend of Audrey, his snobby sister. Yet here she was, standing boldly in my daughter's home, drinking from my daughter's glassware and wearing a fortune bought with stolen money. I expected to hear Preston bragging about his conquests, or whispering sweet, meaningless nothings into her ear. Instead, the conversation took a sharp, nasty turn. Savannah took a delicate sip of her drink and ran a hand down Preston's chest, asking him why he seemed so incredibly tense. She told him he had been grinding his teeth ever since they walked through the front door. Preston pulled away from her, slightly running a hand through his expensive, tailored haircut. He let out a bitter, frustrated sigh and started pacing heavily across the hardwood floor. He told her he was furious because his idiot blue-collar father-in-law had just officially cut off the monthly commercial lease payments for his downtown office. Savannah looked genuinely confused. She asked him why a high-end marketing CEO would ever need his wife's retired father to pay his business rent. She laughed a little, saying she thought he was pulling in millions with all his exclusive corporate clients and massive advertising campaigns. Preston stopped pacing in the middle of the room. He looked at her and let out a sound that chilled me right down to the marrow of my bones. It was a cold, hollow laugh, completely devoid of any real joy or humanity. Preston took a long swallow of his scotch and told Savannah to wake up and look around. He told her the elite marketing agency was nothing but a beautiful, elaborate stage play. He confessed right there in the open air that he had not landed a single real corporate client in over 12 months. His fancy downtown office with the glass walls, the modern art and the imported espresso machines was just a shiny, completely empty shell. Savannah stood frozen near the marble island. She asked him how he was paying for his imported sports car, his custom suits, and the $15,000 diamond necklace she was currently wearing around her neck, if he had zero income. Preston smiled that slick, arrogant smile of his. He proudly explained that he had been hosting private, lavish investment dinners for the last year, inviting all of his sister Audrey's wealthy country club friends. He had been pitching them phantom equity in a revolutionary digital advertising software that did not actually exist. He was taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment capital from Atlanta high society and funneling it straight into his own personal lifestyle. He was using my hard-earned $4,600 every single month just to keep the physical office doors open so those rich investors would not get suspicious when they drove by. He was running a classic, devastating Ponzi scheme right under everyone's noses and using my working-class charity as his primary protective shield. I sat in the dark, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his deception. This boy was not just a cheating, arrogant husband who insulted my daughter. He was a ruthless, white-collar criminal actively defrauding his own sister's social circle. He was living a life funded purely by theft and lies, while treating my sweet, hard-working Chloe like an absolute burden. But the absolute worst part of this nightmare was yet to come. Savannah walked over and wrapped her arms back around his waist, clearly unfazed by the fact that her lover was a massive fraud. She asked him what he was going to do now that I had pulled the funding and his wife was gone from the house. She playfully asked if he was finally going to get rid of his dead-weight family so they could take the remaining investor money and disappear to a luxury island somewhere. Preston kissed her forehead and told her she did not need to worry about a single thing. He said he had already spent the entire afternoon meeting with his family's high-priced, ruthless attorneys. He laid out a master plan so deeply evil it made my breath catch sharply in my throat. Preston calmly explained that he was not going to let Chloe just walk away quietly. If she filed for a standard divorce, the family court might dig into his finances and expose his fraudulent shell company to the federal authorities. Instead, he was going to completely destroy her first. He told Savannah he was going to use those top-tier lawyers to file an emergency motion claiming Chloe was severely mentally unstable and suffering from dangerous emotional breakdowns. He bragged that his parents and his sister Audrey would eagerly testify under oath that Chloe was an unfit mother who abandoned her home in a hysterical, reckless fit. He planned to rip full permanent custody of my 2-year-old grandson, Leo, right out of Chloe's loving arms. Taking a mother's child was not nearly enough for this monster. He told Savannah that once he secured full legal custody of Leo, he was going to demand massive monthly child support and permanent alimony from Chloe. Since Chloe was a dedicated stay-at-home mother with zero independent income, the courts would inevitably look at her family support system. Preston openly laughed as he said he was going to squeeze me dry. He planned to legally bleed my retirement savings and my business accounts to pay the child support, ultimately keeping his fake marketing agency afloat with my hard-earned money. He was going to use my innocent grandson as a financial hostage to fund his mistress and his luxurious criminal lies. He stated that once he drained my accounts, he would put Chloe in a psychiatric facility and send Leo to a strict boarding school so he and Savannah could live in absolute peace. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat in my kitchen chair as the clock ticked past midnight, then 2 in the morning, and finally, the early gray light of dawn began to creep through the window blinds. I turned off the live camera feed on my phone. The battery was almost dead, and so was the last remaining shred of my patience. 40 years ago, when I first started working on high-voltage lines, a seasoned foreman told me something I never forgot. He said electricity is invisible and silent until it strikes, and by the time you see the flash, it is already too late to run. Preston Sterling thought he was the one controlling the entire narrative. He thought his expensive lawyers and his elaborate web of deceit made him the smartest, most powerful man in the city. He had absolutely no idea that I had just recorded every single word of his federal confession. I stood up from the table, my joints stiff from sitting completely still for 8 unbroken hours. I walked over to the coffee maker to brew a fresh, warm pot for Chloe. She and little Leo were still sleeping peacefully in the back bedroom, safely tucked away from the violent storm of lies swirling outside. I wanted to let them rest as long as possible. I knew the massive battle ahead was going to require every ounce of strength we possessed. I reached for a simple ceramic mug, but before my fingers could even touch the handle, a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed through the quiet house. It was not a polite, neighborly knock. It was the loud, demanding pounding of authority. The sound rattled the front door so hard, it made the decorative glass panes vibrate in their frames. I walked down the hallway, my heavy work boots completely silent on the hardwood floors. I looked through the peephole and saw a large, burly man in a cheap gray suit holding a thick manila envelope. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. The cold morning air rushed inside, washing over my face. The man looked at me with a bored, tired expression, completely indifferent to the sheer destruction he was carrying in his hands. He asked me if Chloe Sterling was currently present at this address. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten securely. I told him she was resting and asked him what his specific business was here at my house so early in the morning. He did not hesitate or offer any polite explanation. He simply shoved the heavy manila envelope directly against my chest, forcing me to take it. He coldly stated that he was a court-appointed process server and that Chloe had been officially served. I closed the door, slowly staring down at the thick, heavy stack of legal documents resting in my hands. The front page bore the official embossed seal of the family court district. Bold black letters spelled out an emergency motion for full physical custody and a mandatory immediate psychological evaluation. Preston had not wasted a single minute of his time. He had taken the money he stole from those high society investors and hired the most vicious legal sharks in Atlanta to strike the very first crushing blow. My daughter was waking up in the next room completely unaware that her husband was actively trying to rip her child away and declare her legally insane. Preston thought he had caught us completely off guard. He truly thought this massive stack of intimidating legal papers would break our spirit and force us into a rapid, terrified surrender. But as I held those documents tightly in my hands, I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt the cold, steady hum of a live wire, perfectly ready to burn an entire false empire straight to the ground. The war had officially arrived at my doorstep. I closed the heavy front door and stood in the quiet hallway of my home. The thick stack of legal documents felt like a block of solid lead in my calloused hands. I could hear my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in my ears. Before I could even turn around to hide the manila envelope, I heard the soft shuffle of bare feet on the hardwood floor. Chloe was standing at the end of the hall. She was holding a warm bottle of milk for little Leo. She took one look at my face and then her eyes dropped down to the massive pile of papers in my grip. I saw the exact moment her entire world shattered all over again. She walked toward me with slow, hesitant steps like she was approaching a dangerous animal. She reached out with trembling fingers and took the papers from my hands. I watched her eyes scan the bold black letters printed on the very first page. Emergency motion for sole physical custody. Petition for mandatory psychological evaluation. Unfit mother. The heavy glass milk bottle slipped right out of her grip and crashed onto the floor, spilling warm white liquid everywhere. Chloe let out a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. It was a deep, guttural cry of absolute pure terror. She collapsed onto her knees right there in the hallway, clutching those awful papers to her chest. She was sobbing so hard she could barely draw a breath. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and told me that Preston was going to win. She said his family had millions of dollars and a whole army of vicious lawyers who knew exactly how to destroy people. She cried out that they were going to label her insane and lock her away. She was completely terrified that she would never see her baby boy again. She felt like a tiny, fragile boat caught in the middle of a massive, devastating hurricane. The Sterling family was using their vast, unearned wealth to crush her spirit and steal the only thing that mattered to her. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or join her in the chaos. I simply knelt down on the wet floor right in the spilled milk and wrapped my strong arms around my weeping daughter. I held her tight and let her cry out all that poisoned fear. I waited until her violent shaking finally started to slow down into quiet, heavy hiccups. I took the damp legal papers out of her hands and tossed them aside like they were nothing but worthless trash. I looked directly into her swollen eyes, and I spoke with a voice as solid and heavy as a concrete foundation. I told her to listen to me very carefully. I told her that Preston and his arrogant family think they hold all the power because they know how to print intimidating words on fancy legal letterhead. I wiped a tear from her cheek and promised her right then and there. I told her they play with paper, but we play with fire. I promised her that no judge in this city was going to take my grandson away, and no spoiled, entitled coward was going to declare my daughter insane. I helped her stand up off the floor and walked her back into the warm kitchen. I told her to go sit with Leo and focus on nothing but loving that little boy. I had some very serious work to do. I walked into my study and gathered everything I needed. I took the high-capacity flash drive containing the crystal-clear video of Preston kissing his wealthy mistress, Savannah. I grabbed the digital audio files where he openly bragged about running a fraudulent shell company and stealing money from his sister's country club friends. I packed up the $15,000 diamond necklace receipt and the bank statements proving I was the sole financial provider for his fake commercial empire. I put all of it into my battered leather work briefcase. I grabbed my truck keys and walked out into the cold, bright morning. I knew exactly where I needed to go and exactly who I needed to see. I drove straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. I parked my old truck outside a sleek, towering glass building that housed some of the most expensive corporate law firms in the entire state. I was not there to hire a standard family court attorney. I was there to see my oldest and most dangerous friend. His name was Silas. Silas and I grew up together on the rough south side of the city. While I learned to work with my hands pulling wire and bending steel, Silas learned to fight with his mind. He spent 40 years ripping greedy corporate executives to shreds in federal courtrooms. He was a ruthless, brilliant bulldog of an attorney who had recently gone into semi-retirement. But I knew Silas still kept a private corner office for special cases, and he owed me a massive favor from a long time ago. I walked past the shocked receptionist in my heavy denim jacket and work boots, and opened the heavy mahogany door to his private suite. Silas was sitting behind a massive desk, sipping black coffee and reading a thick legal brief. He looked up, adjusted his expensive glasses, and smiled a wide, genuine smile. He told me it had been way too long, and asked what brought a stubborn, retired electrician all the way down to the corporate district. I did not smile back. I walked right up to his pristine desk, unzipped my leather bag, and dumped the emergency custody papers, the flash drive, and the financial documents right onto his clean blotter. I told him I needed to completely destroy a man named Preston Sterling. Silas saw the cold, dead, serious look in my eyes, and his smile instantly vanished. He told his secretary to hold all of his calls for the rest of the day and locked his office door. We sat there for 3 solid hours. Silas plugged the flash drive into his computer. He watched the high-definition video of Preston parading Savannah through my daughter's house. He listened with absolute intense focus to the audio recording. He heard Preston arrogantly confessing to running a massive Ponzi scheme using my lease money as a shield, and plotting to lock Chloe in a psychiatric ward just to steal alimony to fund his failing criminal business. I watched the muscles in Silas' jaw tighten. Silas was a man who had seen the absolute worst of human greed, but even he looked physically disgusted by the sheer evil calculation in Preston's voice. When the audio finally stopped playing, Silas leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, heavy breath. He tapped his gold pen against the desk and looked at me with the eyes of a seasoned general preparing for total war. Silas explained the brutal reality of the legal system to me. He said that if we just walked into family court with these audio recordings and tried to play defense against the custody papers, we would be walking straight into a massive trap. He told me that the Sterling family had deep political connections and incredibly vicious lawyers. They would argue that the audio was obtained illegally. They would drag the proceedings out for years, bankrupting me with legal fees and dragging Chloe's good name through the absolute mud. Silas said that playing defense in family court against old money is a losing game. He told me we had to go strictly on the offense. We had to hit Preston so hard and so fast that his powerful family would not even have time to blink. Silas pointed his pen right at me and laid out the master tactic. He said we needed to completely bypass the family court system and aim straight for the federal government. Preston admitted on that recording that he was actively defrauding wealthy investors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund his luxurious lifestyle. Silas explained that if we could absolutely prove Preston was running a fraudulent Ponzi scheme, he would face severe federal wire fraud charges. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission would immediately raid his agency and freeze every single asset attached to his name. Silas looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the killing blow. He said a federal indictment for massive financial fraud instantly strips a man of any and all custody rights. No family court judge in the entire country would ever hand a 2-year-old child over to a man facing 20 years in federal prison. The strategy was absolutely brilliant and completely devastating. We would not fight Preston over custody at all. We would simply remove him from society entirely. But Silas held up his hand, stopping my train of thought. He warned me that there was one massive complication. The audio recording alone was not enough to trigger an immediate emergency federal warrant before the upcoming custody hearing. It was enough to start a slow investigation, but we did not have time for slow. Silas said we needed physical concrete proof of the financial crimes. We needed the actual banking ledgers, the fake client invoices, and the off-the-books investor tracking sheets. We needed the hard physical evidence that Preston was using to manage his stolen money. I sat there in the quiet office, running my rough hands over my face. I thought about the conversation I had heard on the hidden camera. Preston was a paranoid, arrogant man. He would never keep evidence of a massive federal crime in his suburban home where his wife might accidentally find it. He would keep it locked away in his personal sanctuary. He would keep it hidden at his fake boutique marketing agency downtown. I looked up at Silas and told him exactly where those ledgers had to be. They were locked inside the heavy steel safe sitting in the back office of Preston's agency. Silas nodded slowly, confirming my exact suspicion. But then the reality of the situation hit me like a speeding freight train. I had just called the commercial property manager yesterday morning. I had officially and legally severed my financial guarantor status and canceled the automatic monthly rent payments. Preston was already in severe default. The landlord was preparing to officially seize the property and lock the glass doors forever. We needed those physical ledgers immediately, but they were locked inside a building that was rapidly slipping out of our reach. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair and walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the busy Atlanta streets. My mind was racing, analyzing every single variable and every possible angle. Silas told me that getting a legal subpoena for that safe would take weeks, and by then Preston would likely destroy the evidence to save himself. We were staring at a rapidly closing window of opportunity. The entire strategy, the safety of my innocent grandson, and the mental survival of my beautiful daughter, all hinged on getting those specific documents out of that specific safe before the landlord changed the commercial locks. I turned away from the bright window and looked back at my old friend. I zipped up my leather work briefcase and hoisted it onto my shoulder. Silas asked me what I was planning to do. He warned me not to do anything reckless that would land me in a jail cell right next to Preston. I gave Silas a cold, measured look. I told him that I spent 40 years learning how buildings breathe, how their electrical veins function, and how to bypass systems that most people think are completely secure. I told him to draft the federal whistleblower documents and have his contacts at the Federal Bureau on standby. I was going back to that flashy downtown marketing agency tonight. I was going to crack that safe wide open and retrieve the very tools we needed to burn Preston Sterling to ashes. The afternoon sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the crowded streets. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, with the engine idling, staring at the glowing dashboard. Silas had given me the strategy, but I had to execute the physical mission. I needed to get my hands on those hidden financial ledgers before Preston realized his entire house of cards was about to collapse. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the direct line to Richard, the commercial real estate manager who oversaw Preston's building. Richard picked up on the second ring, sounding incredibly stressed. He immediately started talking about the massive headache of the bounced payment and the legal paperwork he was forced to file. I cut him off gently but firmly. I reminded Richard that because I was the primary financial guarantor on that commercial lease, my name carried specific legal weight. I told him that according to the default clauses in our contract, I possessed a strict 48-hour window of legal access to the property to clear out personal fixtures and secure my investments before the final lockout was enforced. Richard was a cautious man. He tried to argue that Preston was still the occupying tenant and that granting me access might cause a disruptive scene in his premium high-rise. I promised Richard absolute discretion. I told him I would go in late at night, long after the corporate suits had gone home to their families. I assured him there would be no shouting, no broken glass, and absolutely no trouble for his security team. I just needed to retrieve what rightfully belonged to me. Richard let out a long, heavy sigh through the receiver. He knew he could not legally deny me entry during this specific grace period. He finally agreed, giving me official clearance until midnight the following day. That simple verbal confirmation was the golden key I desperately needed. I drove back to my house on the south side to gather my supplies. Chloe was in the living room feeding little Leo a bowl of warm oatmeal. She looked so incredibly fragile and exhausted by the massive legal assault Preston had launched that morning. I kissed the top of her head, told her I had some errands to run, and promised her once again that nobody was going to take her son away. I walked down to my basement workshop and pulled out my heavy black canvas gear bag. I packed a high-powered LED flashlight, a set of precision screwdrivers, a portable digital scanner, and my specialized diagnostic multimeter. I was preparing to walk into the belly of the beast, and I needed to be ready for whatever digital walls Preston thought could keep me out. I waited until 11 o'clock that night before driving back into the heart of the city. The towering glass buildings of the financial district were mostly dark, standing like giant silent monuments against the cloudy night sky. I parked my truck in the underground parking garage and took the service elevator up to the 14th floor. The hallway was completely empty, heavily carpeted, and smelling of expensive industrial cleaning supplies. I walked down the long corridor until I reached the frosted glass double doors of Preston's boutique marketing agency. The company logo was etched beautifully into the glass, projecting an aura of massive success and wealth. It made my stomach turn knowing it was all funded by my hard-earned sweat and the stolen money of gullible investors. I swiped the temporary access card Richard had authorized for me. The heavy glass doors unlocked with a soft electronic click. I stepped inside the dark office and let the door shut quietly behind me. The space was eerily silent. The moonlight filtering through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated the ridiculous luxury Preston had surrounded himself with. I saw the imported Italian leather sofas, the sleek modern art pieces hanging on the walls, and the premium espresso machines sitting on the marble breakroom counters. It was a beautiful, empty stage designed to trick wealthy people into handing over their fortunes. I did not waste any time marveling at the fake scenery. I moved quickly and silently down the main corridor, making my way straight toward Preston's private corner office at the very back of the suite. When I reached his heavy, solid oak door, I found it locked. A standard commercial keypad was mounted on the wall right next to the handle, glowing with a faint red light. Preston was incredibly paranoid about his private space. He had bragged at family dinners about the expensive security company he hired to install a top-tier alarm system, specifically for his personal office. But Preston was just a smooth-talking salesman. He did not understand the basic physical reality of how these systems actually communicated with each other. I pulled the specialized diagnostic multimeter from my black canvas bag. I knelt down and carefully popped the bottom cover off the keypad housing. I found the low-voltage transmission wires running directly into the magnetic lock plate. I attached my copper testing clips, applied a precise targeted surge of reverse electrical current, and completely overwhelmed the internal circuit board. The red light flickered violently, flashed green for a fraction of a second, and the heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a dull, heavy thud. I pushed the oak door open and stepped into Preston's inner sanctum. The office was massive and reeked of his expensive signature cologne. I pulled out my flashlight, keeping the beam pointed strictly toward the floor so nobody outside the building would see the light passing across the windows. I moved behind his massive polished mahogany desk and began searching for the true prize. Silas had told me that a man running a financial scam will never leave his real accounting ledgers sitting out in the open or stored on a regular cloud server. He would keep the hard evidence locked away securely in a physical safe. I shined my light along the dark paneled walls until I noticed a large abstract painting hanging slightly off-center near the private bathroom door. I reached out and carefully swung the heavy canvas painting to the sit. Behind it, completely recessed into the drywall, was a sleek, modern steel safe. It was a high-end digital model with a smooth touchscreen numeric pad. A lesser man might have panicked seeing that thick steel door, but I actually smiled in the dark. I knew Preston Sterling better than he knew himself. Preston was a deeply arrogant, profoundly narcissistic man who firmly believed he was the most important person to ever walk the face of the earth. Men with that level of blinding self-obsession are incredibly lazy and remarkably predictable when it comes to passwords. They never use complicated random sequences because their entire universe constantly revolves around themselves. I stood in front of the digital pad and entered his birth month, his birthday, and the 4 digits of his birth year. I held my breath as the small screen processed the numbers. A bright green light flashed across the top of the safe, followed by the beautiful sound of heavy steel locking bolts sliding back into the doorframe. The heavy door popped open an inch. Preston had locked away the absolute destruction of his entire life behind a password a complete stranger could have guessed from looking at his social media profile. I pulled the heavy door wide open and shined my flashlight inside the dark metal cavity. There, sitting neatly on the bottom shelf, were throw-thick black leather-bound ledgers and a small silver external hard drive. My heart started hammering a heavy, steady rhythm against my ribs. I reached in and pulled the ledgers out, laying them flat on his mahogany desk. I unzipped my bag and pulled out my portable digital scanner and my cell phone. I flipped open the first ledger and directed the beam of my flashlight across the crisp white pages. What I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten columns and complex financial tracking sheets. Preston was running 2 completely different sets of books. The first column listed massive deposits from private individuals. I recognized several of the prominent wealthy names, including close friends of his sister, Audrey. The second column detailed exactly where that incoming money was actually going. It was not going into software development or legitimate marketing campaigns. The money was being rapidly funneled into personal luxury vehicle payments, private offshore accounts, massive jewelry purchases, and exorbitant monthly stipends to his mistress, Savannah. I flipped through page after page, completely sickened by the sheer magnitude of the deception. Preston was actively robbing his own sister's high society social circle to fund his secret life of luxury. I looked at the grand total calculated at the bottom of the final page. He had systematically defrauded these investors out of over $1.2 million. It was a massive, sprawling federal crime neatly documented in his own arrogant handwriting. I immediately set to work. I used my portable scanner and my high-resolution phone camera to photograph every single page of those black ledgers. I made sure the lighting was perfect and the numbers were crystal clear. I took the small silver hard drive and quickly cloned the entire directory using an encrypted transfer cable I had brought along. I was literally holding the absolute key to my daughter's permanent freedom and the total destruction of the Sterling family empire. If Audrey and her wealthy friends ever found out that Preston had stolen over $1 million of their personal money, the fallout would be apocalyptic. They would tear him to pieces long before the federal authorities even had a chance to put him in handcuffs. Preston's master plan to destroy Chloe in family court and drain my retirement accounts was officially dead. I had gathered enough nuclear material to wipe his entire arrogant existence off the map. I carefully placed the black leather ledgers and the silver hard drive back into the steel safe exactly the way I had found them. I closed the heavy door, listening to the satisfying mechanical whir of the locking bolts sliding firmly back into place. I swung the abstract painting back to its original position, concealing the safe perfectly against the dark, paneled wall. I packed my digital scanner, my phone, and my electrical tools safely back into my heavy canvas bag. A deep, powerful sense of protective victory washed over my entire spirit. I had done it. I had the absolute proof to protect my innocent grandson and save my daughter from a lifetime of misery. I slung the heavy strap of the canvas bag over my broad shoulder and turned off my flashlight. I stood in the absolute darkness of the private office, preparing to make my quiet exit out of the building and back to the safety of my truck. But just as I took my very first step toward the heavy oak door, a sound echoed through the silent office suite that made every single muscle in my body instantly freeze. It was the distinct, sharp noise of the main glass double doors at the front of the agency being unlocked. I stopped breathing entirely. My boots were planted firmly on the thick carpet. I strained my ears, listening to the heavy glass doors swing open and click shut. The main hallway lights suddenly flickered on, flooding the reception area with bright fluorescent light that spilled under the crack of the office door. I heard the unmistakable sound of 2 pairs of shoes walking across the polished hardwood floors of the outer corridor. Then I heard the voices. The arrogant, confident tone of Preston Sterling complaining loudly about the freezing rain outside. And responding to him was the sharp, unmistakable, elite voice of his sister, Audrey. They were talking rapidly about a sudden emergency financial meeting regarding the missing investment funds. They were walking directly down the main hallway, heading straight for the private corner office. I was completely trapped inside the dark room. There was no secondary exit, no large window to climb out of, and absolutely nowhere to hide my large frame. The heavy footsteps were getting louder and closer by the second. I stood in the dark, gripping the handle of my tool bag, preparing for a direct collision that was going to blow this entire massive war wide open. I took a deep, silent breath, planting my feet firmly on the ground, ready to face the absolute devil himself. I stood completely frozen in the absolute darkness of that private office, holding the heavy strap of my canvas tool bag. I did not dare to take a single breath. The heavy glass doors at the front of the agency had just clicked shut, and the bright fluorescent lights of the main hallway bled under the crack of the solid oak door. I could hear the sharp, distinct clicking of expensive high heels stepping onto the polished hardwood floor, accompanied by the heavy, confident stride of dress shoes. It was Preston and his elitist sister, Audrey. They were walking straight down the corridor, heading directly for the corner office where I was trapped. Preston was complaining loudly about the freezing rain outside and whining about a sudden emergency financial meeting Audrey had demanded. My heart was hammering a massive, frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I refused to let panic take the wheel. I am 62 years old, and I spent 4 decades working high up on commercial scaffolding, dealing with live currents that could stop a man's heart rate in a fraction of a second. You learn very quickly that fear is a useless distraction. You have to focus on the structure around you. I looked quickly around the dark room. A man like Preston looks at a high-rise office and sees only luxury and prestige. A master electrician looks at the exact same room and sees the skeleton hiding behind the drywall. Commercial buildings of this size do not just have one way in and one way out. They are built with a complex network of hidden utility chases designed to allow maintenance crews to run thick bundles of fiber optic cables and heavy power lines between the floors without disturbing the corporate suits. I stepped silently behind the massive mahogany desk and ran my rough hands along the back wall. My calloused fingers felt a faint, almost imperceptible seam in the premium wallpaper. It was a flush-mounted utility access panel, perfectly camouflaged to blend in with the expensive decor. I pulled my flathead screwdriver from my belt, slid the thin metal tip into the microscopic gap, and popped the internal magnetic latch. The heavy metal cover swung silently inward, revealing a narrow vertical service shaft that smelled of cold concrete and ancient dust. I heard Preston slide his keycard into the electronic lock on the office door. The mechanism beeped a sharp, high-pitched confirmation. I grabbed my heavy tool bag, squeezed my broad shoulders into the cramped utility shaft, and pulled the disguised metal panel flush against the wall, just as the heavy oak door swung open. Through the thin drywall, I could hear Preston aggressively flicking on the light switch. I was standing so close to the wall, I could actually smell the sharp citrus notes of his expensive cologne. I wedged my work boots against the cold cinder blocks, holding my body perfectly still in the pitch-black shaft. I listened as Audrey began to interrogate her brother, demanding to know why several of her wealthy friends had not received their quarterly portfolio updates. Preston smoothly lied to her face, using slick corporate buzzwords to brush off her concerns. I did not stick around to listen to his garbage excuses. I turned sideways and began to shuffle slowly and methodically down the narrow access tunnel. The space was incredibly tight, scraping roughly against the shoulders of my denim jacket, but I kept moving. I navigated the dark vertical shaft for what felt like an eternity, until my hands finally felt the cold steel of a heavy fire door. I pushed the crash bar and slipped out into the echoing concrete stairwell of the emergency exit. I walked down 14 flights of stairs, slipped quietly out through the loading dock doors, and disappeared into the wet, freezing Atlanta night. I climbed into the cab of my truck, tossed the canvas bag onto the passenger seat, and finally allowed myself to take a deep, massive breath of cold air. I had done it. I had the physical digital proof securely in my possession. The monster was officially dead. He just did not know it yet. The sun was barely peeking over the city skyline the next morning when I walked into the private suite of my bulldog attorney Silas. He was already sitting at his massive desk, nursing a mug of black coffee. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I unzipped my bag, pulled out the cloned silver hard drive, and handed it directly to him. We spent the next 3 grueling hours projecting those stolen financial ledgers onto his large wall monitor, poring over every single fake invoice and every fraudulent bank transfer. Silas just kept shaking his head, taking furious, aggressive notes on his yellow legal pad. Preston had not just skimmed a little bit of money off the top to lease a fancy sports car. He had orchestrated a massive, calculated slaughter of generational wealth. But the real lightning bolt hit us when we began to closely examine the source column of the investor list. We started cross-referencing the names attached to the massive cash deposits, and a horrifying, brilliant picture began to form. Preston had not recruited these wealthy victims on his own. He was using his sister Audrey as the ultimate bait. Audrey was a prominent figure in the Atlanta high society scene. She was the one mingling at the exclusive country club luncheons, the charity galas, and the private tennis matches, constantly bragging to her rich elite friends about her brilliant little brother and his highly exclusive marketing agency. She had unwittingly handed him millions of dollars in investments on an absolute silver platter. Silas tapped his gold pen against the desk and smiled, a very dark, very dangerous smile. He looked at me and explained the profound psychological weapon that we were currently holding in our hands. Silas said that people like Audrey Sterling care about one thing above absolutely all else. They care about their pristine social standing. They live and breathe for their reputation among their wealthy peers. If Audrey found out that the millions of dollars her elite friends had handed over were completely gone, squandered on luxury watches, and a high society mistress named Savannah, she would not protect her brother for a single second. She would violently throw him under a fleet of buses to save her own reputation from the inevitable federal fallout. Preston had built his entire criminal foundation on a massive powder keg, and he had foolishly handed his own sister the match, Just as Silas was mapping out our aggressive strategy to forward these explosive files directly to the federal authorities. His private office phone rang sharply. He picked up the receiver and listened for a moment, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. He thanked the person on the other end, hung up the phone, and looked across the desk at me with a deeply grim expression. Preston had just dropped a massive legal bomb of his own. His high-priced vicious attorneys had officially filed an aggressive emergency ex parte motion in the family court system. They were striking hard, and they were striking incredibly fast. Preston was not just demanding full physical custody of little Leo anymore. His lawyers had petitioned the court to mandate an immediate psychological evaluation for Chloe. They were actively trying to legally brand my sweet, heartbroken daughter as an unfit, unstable, and hysterical mother. They claimed she had abandoned her marital home in a reckless state of mental decline. But the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the man did not stop there. Preston knew perfectly well that Chloe had retreated to my house for protection, so he aimed his high-powered legal guns right at my chest. The emergency motion included a vicious financial injunction directed entirely at me. Preston's lawyers officially claimed to a judge that I was actively hiding marital funds on Chloe's behalf to keep money away from her husband. They were petitioning the family court to immediately freeze every single one of my personal bank accounts, my retirement pension, and the commercial operating assets of my electrical supply company. The absolute audacity of the man was breathtaking. He was funding his entire criminal lifestyle with stolen investor money, keeping his fake office open with my monthly charity, and now he was trying to legally cripple me so I could not even afford to hire an attorney to fight back. He wanted to completely starve us out, leaving my daughter entirely defenseless and my innocent grandson at his absolute mercy. When I drove back to the south side and broke the terrible news to Chloe, she physically collapsed into one of the wooden kitchen chairs. She put her face in her trembling hands and wept with a deep, agonizing despair. She was completely terrified that the slow, grinding legal system was going to crush us into dust before we even had a chance to speak our truth. She felt like Preston was a giant, unbeatable giant who held all the wealth and all the power in the city. I poured her a glass of cold water, rubbed her shaking shoulders, and told her to wipe her eyes. I realized right then and there that playing a slow defensive game in the sterile, quiet halls of a family courthouse was exactly what Preston wanted. He wanted to hide behind closed doors and slick lawyers dragging us through years of painful, expensive litigation. I was absolutely not going to give him that privilege. If you want to kill a poisonous weed, you do not just trim the leaves. You have to rip the entire root system completely out of the ground and expose it to the blinding sun. Later that same afternoon, Silas called me back with a piece of information that felt like an absolute divine gift from the heavens. He had been digging deeper into the cloned hard drive, looking at Preston's corporate calendar and his recent massive outgoing expenditures. Silas discovered that Preston was scheduled to host a lavish, massive event at one of the most exclusive premium country clubs in Buckhead that very weekend. Preston was calling it his 5-year agency anniversary gala. He had formally invited every single wealthy investor, his entire extended family, and the absolute highest tiers of Atlanta society to celebrate his grand corporate success. He was funding the elaborate ice sculptures, the premium imported champagne, and the live string quartet entirely with the money he had actively stolen from the very people who would be standing in that ballroom. It was a sickening, disgusting display of pure criminal arrogance. I stood on my back porch looking out over my quiet, modest yard, feeling a deep, powerful, and absolute calm settle permanently into my old bones. Preston Sterling wanted to freeze my hard-earned bank accounts. He wanted to legally steal my grandson. He wanted to declare my beautiful daughter insane and parade his fake stolen wealth in front of the entire city. I decided right then and there that I was not going to wait for a federal judge to sign a slow-moving warrant next month. I was not going to play defense in a quiet courtroom. I was going to take the ugly, horrific truth, wrap it in a heavy concrete block, and throw it straight through the front window of his beautiful, fragile glass house. I was going to attend that fancy anniversary gala, and I was going to burn Preston Sterling to absolute ashes in front of every single person he ever tried to impress. The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds just past 6 o'clock, but I had not slept a single wink. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear into the cool morning air. From down the hall, I could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of my daughter Chloe and my little grandson Leo. They were completely exhausted from the tears and the heartbreak of the night before. I just sat there in the quiet house, letting the deep anger from last night settle into a cold, hard focus. In my 40 years of pulling high-voltage wire across this city, I learned that reckless energy gets you killed. You have to ground yourself. You have to respect the power you are working with. Preston Sterling thought he had all the power. He thought his expensive suits and his country club pedigree made him untouchable. He assumed he could humiliate my daughter and face zero consequences because we did not have a famous last name. But he was about to learn that real power does not come from a trust fund. Real power comes from the man who controls the current. At exactly 8 in the morning, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number for the commercial real estate management company that owned Preston's fancy downtown office building. I knew the property manager well. He was a strict, no-nonsense businessman named Richard, who handled all the premium leases in the financial district. When Richard picked up the line, I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I was officially revoking my status as the financial guarantor for the boutique marketing agency on the 14th floor. I informed him that my bank would no longer be authorizing the automatic monthly transfer of $4,600. Richard was quiet for a moment. He knew exactly how much that commercial lease cost, and he knew Preston was consistently late on payments before I quietly stepped in to save his reputation. Richard cleared his throat and asked me if I was absolutely certain about this decision. He warned me that without my financial backing, the agency lease would be in severe default by noon today. I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I thanked him for his time, hung up the phone, and immediately opened my banking app. With a few deliberate taps on the screen, I permanently deleted the recurring payment authorization. Just like that, the massive financial lifeline that kept Preston's fake corporate empire afloat was completely dead. I set the phone face down on the table, took another sip of my dark coffee, and waited. I knew it would not take very long for the shockwave to hit downtown. It took exactly 3 hours. At 11 in the morning, my phone started vibrating aggressively against the kitchen counter. The caller identification flashed Preston's name in bright letters. I let it ring 4 times before I calmly picked up the device and brought it to my ear. I did not say a single word. I just sat there and listened to the sound of him breathing heavily on the other end. Preston was absolutely furious. His voice was completely out of control, loud and high-pitched with pure panic. He demanded to know exactly what was going on with the lease payment. He said the property manager had just walked straight into his office right in front of his entire staff and handed him an official notice of default. Preston screamed at me over the receiver, asking how I could be so incredibly irresponsible and forget to make the scheduled transfer. He actually had the nerve to sound like a disappointed boss reprimanding a lazy employee. I let him yell until his voice cracked and he ran out of breath. I wanted to hear the true desperation in his tone. Then I spoke with a quiet, steady voice that carried absolutely zero emotion. I told him that I did not forget anything. I told him I canceled the payment on purpose. Preston was stunned into absolute silence for a fraction of a second before his ego took over, and he demanded a proper explanation. I pictured him standing in his glass corner office wearing his expensive Italian shoes, sweating through his designer shirt. Then I delivered the exact words I had been practicing all morning. I told him plainly that cows do not pay for premium downtown real estate. The silence on the line was so incredibly thick you could have cut it with a knife. Preston instantly knew exactly what I meant. He realized that Chloe had come straight to my house and told me all about the vile insult he threw at her in front of his snobby sister Audrey. But instead of feeling an ounce of genuine shame or offering a sincere apology, Preston showed me exactly what kind of monster he truly was. The thin, polite veneer of the respectful son-in-law completely vanished in an instant. His voice dropped into a nasty, vicious sneer. He told me that I had no right to pull his business funding over a simple, harmless family joke. Then he decided to attack my pride. He told me I was nothing but a glorified handyman with dirt permanently stuck under his fingernails. He proudly declared that he was a sterling and that his family was practically royalty in this city, while I was just a tired old man who peaked working manual labor. He said I should be begging on my hands and knees, thanking him for giving my simple daughter a fraction of his high society lifestyle. I did not raise my voice or take his bait. I simply told him that royalty usually pays their own bills without asking for charity from a handyman. Then I hung up the phone right in his face. I knew a proud, arrogant man like Preston would not just take a massive hit to his ego and walk away quietly. A cornered animal always lashes out, and Preston was the worst kind of coward. He was the kind of man who attacked the vulnerable when he felt his own pride slipping away. Less than 20 minutes after I hung up the phone, Chloe walked into the kitchen carrying little Leo on her hip. She looked completely exhausted, her beautiful face pale and deeply drawn from crying. Before I could even pour her a comforting cup of coffee, her cell phone chimed loudly. Then it chimed again and again. A rapid, aggressive series of frantic notifications began echoing through my quiet kitchen. Chloe set Leo down in his wooden high chair and pulled her phone from her sweater pocket. I watched all the blood drain entirely from her face. Her hands started trembling so violently she almost dropped the device on the tile floor. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes and told me that her bank accounts were completely empty. Preston had maliciously logged into their joint checking and savings accounts and drained every single penny they had. He transferred all the marital funds to a private offshore account solely in his name. The money they had diligently saved for Leo's future, the monthly grocery budget, the emergency health funds, it was all entirely gone. Chloe was in a state of absolute shock. She quickly tried to log into her credit card portal, but the passwords had already been changed. Preston had effectively cut off her entire financial existence in a matter of minutes. He wanted to punish her for coming to me for protection. He wanted to leave her completely destitute and begging for his mercy. Pure panic truly set in when Chloe realized that all of Leo's important documents were still back at the suburban house she shared with Preston. She desperately needed Leo's birth certificate, his social security card, and his prescription asthma medication, which was securely locked in the nursery cabinet. She started crying uncontrollably, telling me that she had to go back there immediately to get her baby's things before Preston did something even worse to their home. I told her I would not let her go back to that house alone under any circumstances. I grabbed my truck keys, helped her bundle Leo into his warm winter coat, and safely strapped him into his car seat in the back of my vehicle. We drove across town to the upscale gated community where Preston and Chloe lived. The drive felt like it took hours. The whole way there, Chloe was nervously wringing her hands, terrified of what we might find waiting for us. When we pulled up to the sprawling modern house with its perfectly manicured lawn and massive oak doors, my instincts immediately told me something was terribly wrong. The wide driveway was completely empty, but the security panel by the front door was flashing a solid, bright red light. Chloe ran up the concrete front steps and quickly punched her personal code into the electronic keypad. The system beeped loudly and flashed a harsh access denied warning on the digital screen. She frantically tried her physical key in the heavy deadbolt, but the metal cylinder would not even turn. The brass lock mechanism had been completely swapped out. Preston had called an emergency locksmith the very moment I hung up the phone on him. He had officially and illegally locked his own wife and his 2-year-old son out of their own home. Chloe began to pound frantically on the heavy wooden door with both fists. She called out Preston's name, begging him through her tears to just let her get her son's medical supplies and clothes. There was absolutely no answer from inside. The large house stood there cold and silent, refusing to let her inside. I stood on the walkway and watched my beautiful daughter break down, crying on the expensive welcome mat. She felt completely powerless against the vast resources and the cruel, vindictive nature of the Sterling family. She turned to me, sobbing heavily, saying that Preston had finally won. She said he had ruthlessly taken her money, her home, and her dignity, and she had absolutely no legal or financial way to fight back against a man who held all the keys. I walked slowly up those concrete steps and placed my heavy, calloused hands firmly on her shaking shoulders. I told her to wipe her tears and stand up straight. I reminded her once again that she was the daughter of Calvin Hayes, and we do not ever beg outside closed doors. I looked past her shoulder at the massive, beautiful house. Preston thought he was so incredibly smart, changing the locks and resetting the digital security codes from his downtown office. He thought he had built an impenetrable high-tech fortress to keep his wife out in the cold. But Preston forgot something else in his blind rage. Something far more important than a canceled lease payment. 3 years ago, when they first bought this expensive property, it was a total disaster on the inside. The wiring was outdated and highly dangerous. Preston did not want to pay the exorbitant union fees to have the massive house rewired to modern safety standards. So he smiled his fake, charming smile and asked his blue-collar father-in-law to do the massive job for free as a generous wedding gift. I spent 3 grueling weeks crawling through the hot attic, the damp basement, and the tight crawl spaces of that exact house. I pulled every single foot of copper wire myself. I installed every junction box. I mapped out the entire electrical security grid and personally connected the smart locks to the main hidden breaker panel in the garage. I knew the complex electrical blueprints of that suburban house better than the back of my own hand, because I designed every inch of them. I looked at my crying daughter and gave her a calm, reassuring smile. I told her to take little Leo back to the truck and wait where it was safe and warm. I told her that an arrogant man can change all the physical locks in the world, but a lock is just a dumb piece of metal controlled by an electric current. And I am the master who commands the current. Preston Sterling had officially started a war by draining her accounts and locking an innocent child out of his rightful home. But he had absolutely no idea the kind of destructive fire he just invited to his front door. The battle line was firmly drawn in the concrete, and I was about to show that arrogant boy exactly what a glorified handyman can do when you mess with his family. The real war had just begun. The Buckhead Country Club was the kind of place designed to make regular hard-working folks feel entirely invisible. The sprawling estate sat behind tall wrought iron gates, surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured emerald green lawns. As I pulled my vehicle up to the front entrance, a valet in a crisp uniform rushed forward to open the door. He took one look at my weathered hands and hesitated for a fraction of a second before composing himself. I did not give him a chance to speak. I handed him the keys and stepped onto the imported marble walkway. The evening air was crisp and cool, but inside that massive stone building, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating smell of old money, expensive perfume, and unchecked arrogance. This was the fortress of the elite. This was the playground where people like Preston Sterling and his sister Audrey came to pat each other on the back and celebrate their unearned privilege. Tonight they were celebrating a massive lie. Tonight they were toasting to a 5-year anniversary of a marketing agency that was nothing but a hollow, rotting shell. And they were drinking champagne paid for with the stolen savings of every single person standing in that room. I turned and offered my arm to my daughter. Chloe stepped out of the vehicle and took my arm. My breath caught in my throat for a moment, just looking at her. She was not the broken, terrified girl weeping on my kitchen floor over a stack of malicious custody papers. She was not the exhausted mother who had been locked out of her own home by a cruel, vindictive coward. Tonight, Chloe looked like absolute royalty. She was wearing a stunning, deep emerald gown that flowed perfectly down to the marble floor. Her hair was pulled back elegantly, highlighting the sharp, strong features she inherited from her late mother. She held her head high, her shoulders pulled back, and her eyes burned with a fierce, steady fire. She was radiating a quiet, powerful dignity that no amount of trust fund money could ever buy. I looked down at my own attire. I was not wearing a rented tuxedo or a silly bow tie. I was wearing a custom-fitted dark charcoal suit tailored perfectly to my broad frame. It was a suit built for respect. It was a suit built for a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he came to do. We walked together through the grand foyer of the country club. The high vaulted ceilings echoed with the soft murmurs of the wealthy guests and the delicate sounds of a live string quartet drifting from the main ballroom. I could feel the heavy weight of the legal documents tucked safely inside my breast pocket. Those papers were the ultimate weapon. They were the undeniable proof of my financial leverage and the absolute destruction of Preston's fraudulent empire. I had taken a massive, terrifying risk, using my own life savings to buy out his biggest disgruntled investor. But walking through those halls, I knew it was the best investment I had ever made. We bypassed the greeting tables and walked directly toward the massive mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom. 2 attendants in uniform tried to step forward to ask for our invitations, but I gave them a look so incredibly cold and unyielding that they froze perfectly still in their tracks. I did not pause or offer an explanation. I reached out, placed my hands flat against the polished wood of the double doors, and pushed them wide open. The doors swung inward with a heavy, dramatic thud that echoed sharply over the soft music. The scene inside the ballroom was a masterpiece of expensive deception. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests dressed in their absolute finest. Waiters in white coats circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne flutes and gourmet appetizers. In the very center of the room, a massive elevated stage had been constructed, and standing right in the middle of that stage under the bright spotlight was Preston Sterling. He was wearing a flawless, tailored tuxedo, holding a sleek, wireless microphone in his hand. He was right in the middle of delivering a passionate, emotional speech. I could hear his smooth, arrogant voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. He was talking about the immense value of hard work, the importance of building a corporate legacy, and the deep, profound trust his clients placed in his elite marketing firm. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was absolutely sickening. He was standing on a stage built with stolen money, lecturing his very own victims about trust and integrity. When the heavy doors hit the back walls, the loud sound rippled through the packed room like a physical shockwave. The guests standing near the back turned around first. Their polite smiles instantly vanished, replaced by looks of pure confusion. I stepped into the warm light of the ballroom, with Chloe walking tall and proud right by my side. We did not hesitate or wait for an invitation. We began walking straight down the wide center aisle directly toward the stage. As we moved forward, the wealthy crowd naturally parted ways, creating a clear path for us. A heavy, uncomfortable silence began to spread rapidly through the room. The string quartet slowly stopped playing their instruments. The soft murmurs of conversation completely died out. Hundreds of eyes locked onto us, taking in the sight of the dark-suited tradesman and the stunning, betrayed wife walking with terrifying purpose into the heart of high society. I could feel the collective tension rising in the air, but I kept my gaze locked entirely on the man standing under the bright lights. Preston was still talking into the microphone when he finally noticed the commotion in the back of the room. His eyes scanned over the crowd and landed squarely on us. I watched the blood drain completely out of his face. His confident, arrogant smile melted away into an expression of absolute naked terror. He stopped speaking right in the middle of a sentence, leaving a dead, awkward silence hanging in the air. His hand began to tremble slightly, causing the microphone to pick up the harsh sound of his sudden, shallow breathing. He looked completely paralyzed, like a rat caught in the blinding headlights of a massive speeding truck. He knew Chloe was supposed to be hiding in my house, crippled by his malicious custody filing. He knew I was supposed to be a helpless old handyman, crushed by his financial superiority. Yet here we were, marching right into his personal kingdom, completely unafraid and radiating absolute doom. Panic finally broke through Preston's frozen state. He lowered the microphone and desperately waved his free hand toward the side of the room. He locked eyes with the head of the country club security detail, a large, muscular man standing near the catering tables. Preston shouted over the quiet crowd, demanding that the security team immediately remove the trespassers from his private event. He yelled that we were not on the guest list and that we were causing a dangerous disturbance. The head guard nodded sharply and stepped directly into the center aisle, blocking my path to the stage. 3 other large security men quickly fell into formation behind him, preparing to physically bounce us out of the building. The wealthy guests began to whisper nervously to each other, pulling back and giving the guards plenty of room to operate. I did not slow my pace. I walked right up to the head security guard, stopping mere inches from his broad chest. He raised a heavy hand and told me in a gruff, commanding voice that I needed to turn around and exit the premises immediately. He warned me that if I took one more step toward the stage, he would be forced to use physical restraint. I looked the man dead in the eyes, and I did not even blink. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my custom suit jacket. The guards tensed up, preparing for a fight, but I kept my movements smooth and deliberate. I pulled out a thick, folded packet of official legal documents bearing the certified seal of the state commercial court. I unfolded the heavy paper and handed it directly to the head security guard. I wanted him to see the absolute legal reality of the situation before he made a terrible mistake. I spoke with a voice that was perfectly calm, but carried the heavy, crushing weight of absolute authority. I told the guard to look very closely at the signature and the embossed seal on that document. I explained to him that he was holding a certified emergency commercial lien. I told him that just hours ago I had legally purchased the primary outstanding debt of the marketing agency hosting this little party. I had completely bought out the disgruntled primary investor using a massive portion of my own life savings. I told the guard that I was no longer a simple father-in-law. I was officially the absolute largest legal creditor of Preston Sterling's entire corporate entity. I owned the paper his fake empire was built on. I owned the rights to the assets, the accounts, and the very chairs these people were sitting on. I looked past the guard toward the stage and raised my voice just enough so the entire silent room could hear every single word. I announced that I own the debt on this company, and I am legally entitled to be at my own debtors' meeting. The head security guard stared down at the official commercial lien. He was a professional who knew exactly what a certified court order looked like. He read the bold print and saw my name clearly listed as the primary legal creditor. He slowly lowered the documents and looked at Preston up on the stage. Then he looked back at me and simply stepped aside. He signaled his men to stand down and clear the path. The entire room collectively gasped. The absolute elite of Atlanta high society watched in total shock as a working-class man smoothly bypassed a wall of muscle using nothing but cold, hard legal leverage. I turned to Chloe and gave her a gentle, reassuring nod. She stopped at the front row, standing tall and confident, while I walked up the short flight of velvet stairs leading directly onto the main stage. Preston backed away, taking quick, nervous steps backward as I approached him. He looked like a small, terrified child, hiding inside a very expensive tuxedo. His eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for anyone to save him from this nightmare. But there was absolutely nowhere for him to run. I walked right up to him, reached out, and firmly took the wireless microphone right out of his trembling hand. He did not even try to resist. He simply let go of the metal handle, completely defeated by the sheer overwhelming force of the moment. I stood in the center of the bright stage, looking out over the sea of wealthy, confused faces. The silence in the grand ballroom was so incredibly deep, you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system. I held the microphone up to my mouth, preparing to drop the absolute heavy truth right onto their pristine, expensive tables. But before I could even speak my first sentence, a sharp, furious voice shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. A woman shoved her way through the front row of the crowd, pushing past the elegant tables with aggressive, forceful movements. It was Audrey, Preston's incredibly snobby, entitled sister. She was wearing a sparkling designer dress, her face flushed with pure, hot indignation. Audrey had spent the entire evening taking credit for her brilliant brother, mingling with her rich friends, and soaking up the high society praise. Now she was watching a man she considered absolute garbage ruin her perfect, flawless night. Audrey marched right up to the edge of the stage, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. She demanded to know what kind of sick, ridiculous stunt I was pulling. She yelled that I was a crazy, delusional old man who was ruining a beautiful corporate celebration. She screamed at the crowd, telling them not to listen to a single word I said, claiming I was just a bitter, jealous tradesman trying to extort her successful, wealthy family. I stood perfectly still under the bright stage lights, listening to her hysterical, entitled rant. Audrey genuinely believed she was defending a legitimate marketing genius. She had absolutely no idea that she was the primary tool Preston used to steal millions of dollars from the very people standing right behind her. She had no idea that her pristine, untouchable reputation was about to be burned to the ground by her own flesh and blood. I did not raise my voice or argue with her angry accusations. I simply reached back into my dark suit jacket. I pulled out a sleek, thick manila folder containing the copied financial ledgers, the fake client invoices, and the explicit photographic proof of every single stolen dollar. I looked down at Audrey, her face twisted in angry, ignorant defiance, and I held the sleek manila folder high in the air for the entire room to see. I stood perfectly still on that elevated stage, letting the bright, theatrical spotlights wash over my custom-tailored charcoal suit. Audrey was practically vibrating with pure, unadulterated rage right in front of my face. Her perfectly manicured finger was pointing directly at my chest, and her expensive designer gown ruffled as she drew breath to scream. She yelled that I was a bitter, delusional old man who had no business stepping foot inside an elite country club. She demanded to know what kind of sick, ridiculous stunt I was trying to pull by interrupting her brilliant brother's 5-year corporate anniversary. Audrey turned to the hundreds of wealthy guests sitting at their premium tables, shouting at them to ignore me. She claimed I was just a jealous working-class tradesman trying to publicly extort her highly successful and incredibly wealthy family. I let her finish her frantic, hysterical rant. I did not raise my hands to interrupt her, and I certainly did not yell back. When a man has spent 40 years of his life working around live, high-voltage power grids, he learns a very important lesson about energy. The loudest sparks are usually the least dangerous, because they are just burning off useless heat. The real lethal power, the kind of current that can stop a heart in a fraction of a second, is completely silent until the exact moment it strikes. I looked Audrey dead in her furious eyes, and then I shifted my gaze to look out over the vast sea of Atlanta high society. I did not need a microphone. I simply lowered my chin and projected my voice from deep inside my chest, using the same heavy, booming tone I used to coordinate massive industrial construction sites. I told the entire silent ballroom that Audrey was absolutely right about one thing. I told them I was just a simple blue-collar handyman who worked for a living. But I was a handyman who knew exactly how to read a balance sheet, and I knew exactly how to track a stolen dollar. I held out the sleek, thick manila folder, offering it directly to Audrey. She glared at me, but her curiosity and her desperate need to prove me wrong forced her to snatch the folder right out of my calloused hands. I spoke to the silent crowd while she opened the cover. I made sure my voice reached the very back tables where the wealthiest investors were sipping their premium champagne. I announced clearly that Preston Sterling had never invested a single dime of their money into any revolutionary marketing software. I told them there were no corporate clients and there were no massive advertising campaigns. I explained that Preston took their hard-earned trust and he spent their investment capital on imported luxury sports cars. He spent it on private offshore bank accounts. He spent it on a $15,000 custom platinum diamond necklace for a mistress named Savannah. I told the room that the very stage we were standing on, the expensive caviar they were currently eating, and the lease for the fake downtown office were all paid for by two distinct sources: the stolen money of Audrey's country club friends and the monthly charity of my own personal retirement account. Audrey ripped the folder open, ready to call me a liar. But her angry eyes hit the very first page and she instantly froze. It was a high-resolution, full-color photograph of the handwritten financial ledger. It was the exact secret ledger Preston had locked inside his hidden wall safe. I watched her perfectly painted lips part in absolute horror as she recognized the handwriting. She flipped to the second page with trembling fingers. It was a certified bank statement showing her best friend's massive investment deposit being immediately transferred to an exclusive jeweler in Buckhead. She frantically flipped to the third page. It was a crystal-clear, glossy photograph taken from my hidden wall camera, showing Preston passionately kissing Savannah in the middle of my daughter's living room. The heavy crystal champagne flute that Audrey had been holding slipped straight through her weak fingers. It hit the polished wooden stage and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp sound of that breaking glass broke the magical spell holding the room hostage. An older, distinguished gentleman in a tailored tuxedo stepped forward from the front row and snatched the legal papers right out of Audrey's frozen hands. He was one of the primary investors who had trusted Preston with his money. I watched the man's face turn bright crimson as his eyes found his own personal name printed next to a massive fraudulent withdrawal on the ledger. He shoved the papers into the hands of the wealthy woman standing next to him. A violent, aggressive wave of terrible realization began to wash over the elite crowd. The polite whispers instantly turned into furious, angry shouts. The elegant high society facade completely evaporated into thin air. These were incredibly wealthy, powerful people, and they had just collectively discovered they were the victims of a massive, humiliating financial scam. They had been played for absolute fools by a smooth-talking boy they thought was a corporate genius. The documents were passed around the front tables like wildfire, spreading panic and outrage with every single glance. My eyes calmly scanned the chaotic sea of angry faces until I spotted the target. Savannah was standing near a towering ice sculpture near the back of the grand ballroom. She was wearing a stunning crimson dress and the exact platinum diamond necklace Preston had bought her using stolen investor funds. She realized the entire room was rapidly turning into a vicious mob out for blood. She tried to quietly back away toward the heavy mahogany double doors, hoping to slip out into the cold night and save her own skin. But the wealthy women in the crowd were absolutely not going to let her escape. A furious older widow who had just lost a massive portion of her retirement fund stepped directly into Savannah's path. 3 other angry country club investors immediately surrounded the mistress, completely blocking the exits. Savannah was trapped and cornered by the very people whose stolen money she was proudly wearing around her neck. I turned my attention back to the man standing beside me on the stage. Preston Sterling was watching his entire beautiful universe burn to ashes in real time. The arrogant, slick corporate executive was completely gone. The horrific realization was hitting his brain with the physical force of a speeding freight train. He knew the furious, wealthy investors in this room were already calling their ruthless lawyers. He knew the federal authorities and the Securities Commission would be kicking down his glass office doors by sunrise. He was staring straight down the barrel of a 20-year sentence in federal prison for massive, deliberate wire fraud. The sheer terror of his new reality completely broke his mind. His expensive Italian leather shoes shifted on the wooden stage, and his legs simply gave out beneath him. Preston collapsed onto his knees right there under the bright theatrical spotlights. The sharp, crisp creases of his custom-tailored tuxedo pants pooled around his ankles in a pathetic heap. He looked up at me with heavy, hot tears streaming down his pale face. The expensive citrus cologne he always bathed himself in was now completely masked by the sour, desperate smell of pure human panic. He reached out with both of his shaking hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my charcoal suit jacket. He started crying and begging out loud in front of hundreds of furious people. He pleaded with me not to send those digital files to the federal authorities. He begged me to stop my bulldog lawyers from contacting the banking commission. He frantically promised he would immediately grant Chloe full permanent custody of little Leo. He swore he would drop the psychological evaluation and cancel the emergency family court motion he had filed that morning. He offered to sign over everything he owned, his cars, his accounts, his fake agency, if I would just show him a tiny fraction of mercy. He was whining and sobbing like a terrified child holding onto my jacket, as if I was his only path to salvation. I stood there like a pillar of solid stone looking down at the pathetic creature weeping at my feet. I thought about the sheer, calculated cruelty he had inflicted on my beautiful daughter. I thought about the heavy stack of emergency custody papers he had sent to my house just to terrorize a loving mother and steal my innocent grandson. I reached down with my calloused working hands and firmly pried his trembling fingers off my suit jacket one by one. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly enough for the angry mob to hear my final, absolute judgment. I told Preston that he had stood in my house and called my daughter a desperate cow. I told him he had laughed with his mistress about milking my family dry and stealing my retirement to fund his criminal lies. I looked him dead in his red, swollen eyes, and I delivered my promise. I told him to look at himself right now. I said he was the one who had been milked completely dry, and now he was left begging on his knees for scraps. I turned my back on Preston Sterling, leaving him sobbing uncontrollably on the floor of his ruined anniversary gala. I offered my arm to Chloe. She took it with a graceful, powerful grip. She did not shed a single tear. She did not even look down at the pathetic man who had tried to destroy her life and take her child. She held her head high, radiating absolute strength and dignity. We walked together off the stage and stepped onto the ballroom floor. The furious crowd of wealthy investors naturally parted for us, stepping aside out of sheer respect for the heavy truth we had delivered to their doorstep. We walked straight down the center aisle, listening to the chaotic shouts of the angry elite demanding answers from the Sterling family. We pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors, leaving the shouting, the panic, and the complete structural destruction of Preston's empire far behind us. We walked out of the country club and stepped into the cool, clean night air, perfectly free. The weekend immediately following the country club gala felt like the deep quiet right before a massive thunderclap. I spent Saturday and Sunday resting in my home, watching Chloe breathe a little easier, knowing the truth was finally out in the open. But by Monday morning, the storm finally broke over the city of Atlanta, and it was an absolutely glorious thing to witness. Federal agents do not care about custom-tailored suits or imported Italian leather sofas. They do not care about country club memberships or elite social status. At exactly 8 in the morning, a fleet of dark, anonymous vehicles pulled up to the glass doors of Preston's downtown marketing agency. Silas, my bulldog attorney, had made sure the financial ledgers and the digital clones were in the exact right hands. The Securities and Exchange Commission, along with a swarm of federal agents, marched right into that fake corporate shell. They did not knock politely, and they did not ask for permission. They swarmed the office and carried out every single computer, every piece of paper, and every shred of false dignity Preston Sterling had left to his name. I heard from Silas later that afternoon that Preston actually tried to talk his way out of the handcuffs. He tried to use his slick salesman charm on the seasoned federal investigators. He tried to claim it was all a simple accounting error and a massive misunderstanding. It did not work. They read him his rights and marched him out through the main lobby for the entire financial district to see. He was officially indicted on multiple counts of massive federal wire fraud and embezzlement. The arrogant boy who thought he was completely untouchable was now staring directly down the barrel of a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. He had traded his beautiful life for a tiny concrete cell, and he had absolutely no one to blame but his own insatiable greed. The absolute destruction did not stop with him. His sister Audrey learned a very brutal and permanent lesson about high society loyalty. The wealthy elite of this city do not ever forgive anyone who messes with their personal money. Audrey had been the golden goose, the one who confidently paraded her brother around the country club and convinced her rich friends to hand over their fortunes. When the news officially broke that their investments had paid for Savannah's diamond necklaces and Preston's luxury cars, the socialite wolves turned on Audrey instantly. Her pristine reputation was burned to absolute ash overnight. She was banned from the charity boards, blocked from the private luncheons, and completely exiled from the only world she ever truly cared about. The Sterling family name, once spoken with such arrogance, was now treated like a foul disease. They had built their entire identity on looking down at working-class folks like me. Now they could not even show their faces in their own elite neighborhoods without being completely humiliated and shunned. While the federal government was dismantling Preston's criminal empire, His vicious family court strategy completely imploded. You cannot demand full custody of a child and claim your wife is mentally unstable when you are sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades in prison. The aggressive legal motion his expensive lawyers filed was laughed right out of the courtroom. Silas made sure the family court judge saw the full, unvarnished picture before the hearing even began. The judge watched the hidden camera video of Preston drinking scotch with his mistress and plotting to lock Chloe in a psychiatric ward just to steal my retirement money. The absolute disgust on the judge's face was something I will cherish for the rest of my life. The gavel came down hard and fast. Preston was stripped of every single parental right. The court granted Chloe full and sole legal custody of little Leo. There would be no shared weekends, no manipulative phone calls, and no dark shadows lingering over my grandson's life ever again. Furthermore, the judge ordered the immediate liquidation of Preston's few remaining legitimate personal assets. His luxury sports car, his expensive watches, and whatever remained in his hidden accounts were seized and sold at auction. The court directed those funds straight to Chloe for permanent child support, giving her the financial foundation she needed to start over. Savannah, the wealthy mistress who had mocked my daughter, took one look at Preston's empty bank accounts and vanished into thin air. She abandoned him the exact second the stolen money dried up, leaving him completely alone to face the ruthless federal prosecutors. He was left with nothing but his ruined pride and a long, bleak future behind bars. Let me tell you about the profound difference between surviving a terrible storm and finally standing in the warm sunlight. I am sitting here right now on my back porch, resting my boots on the wooden railing. I have a warm mug of dark roast coffee in my hand, and the morning air is crisp and incredibly clean. Out in the green grass of the yard, my little grandson Leo is running in circles, chasing a yellow butterfly. He is laughing that deep, pure belly laugh that only a safe and happy child can make. And sitting right over there on the porch swing is my beautiful daughter, Chloe. She is reading a book and sipping her sweet tea. The dark, heavy circles of exhaustion are completely gone from under her eyes. She is smiling again. A real, genuine smile that reaches all the way to her soul. She looks healthy, vibrant, and absolutely free from the chains of a toxic, manipulative marriage. For a very long time, I carried a heavy guilt in my chest, thinking I had failed to protect her when she married that boy. When I first saw those emergency custody papers, my initial biological instinct as a father was to drive straight over to Preston's house and break him in half with my bare hands. Anger is a very loud and very seductive thing. It makes you want to act reckless and seek immediate physical vengeance. But working with high-voltage electricity for 40 years taught me the most valuable lesson a man can ever learn. Reckless anger is just loud, useless sparks, and sparks do not get the heavy job done. True power is completely silent. True power is cold, calculated, and contained until the exact moment you need to flip the switch. I did not keep my family safe by throwing my fists or losing my temper. I kept them safe by using my mind. I played the long, strategic game. I found the hidden wires of his deception, and I routed that destructive current right back into his own house of cards. I took away his money, his freedom, and his fake prestige without ever raising my voice or breaking a single law. Life has a funny way of balancing the scales if you pay close attention and do the hard, necessary work. To all the fathers and grandfathers out there listening to my voice right now, I want you to remember this. Our ultimate job is not just to provide a roof and a warm meal for our families. Our job is to be the silent, unbreakable wall that stands between our flock and the wolves of the world. Sometimes the wolves wear expensive tailored suits and speak with silver tongues. They might drive foreign cars and live behind tall iron gates. Do not ever let them make you feel small just because you work with your hands or drive an old truck. A man who builds things for a living knows exactly how to tear things down when his family is threatened. Trust your instincts when it comes to your children. If you see your child shrinking into a shadow of who they used to be, do not ignore it. Dig deeper into the situation. Find the hidden truth, and be ready to do whatever it takes to bring them back into the light. We have to be the architects of their safety, even when they are too afraid to ask for help. It is a heavy burden, but it is the greatest privilege a man can carry in this lifetime. If my journey today resonated with your spirit, please hit that like button to let this old electrician know he is not speaking into the void. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these hard-earned lessons together. And please take a second to tell me down in the comments exactly where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It brings a profound joy to my heart, knowing how far these stories travel and connecting with good, hard-working folks across the country. Take care of your people, stay vigilant, and always protect your peace. Let me tell you something deeply important before I sign off for the day. Life is absolutely guaranteed to throw arrogant, selfish people your way. You are going to encounter folks who wear expensive, tailored suits, drive flashy foreign cars, and think that just because you work hard with your hands, your mind must be slow. They will look down their noses at your quiet patience and mistake it for simple ignorance. They will look at your generosity and your daily kindness and genuinely believe it is a foolish weakness they can easily exploit for their own personal gain. When that inevitable moment happens, I want you to remember exactly what I did. Do not shout at them. Do not let your hot temper flare up and blind your better judgment. Reckless, loud rage is just a messy distraction that gives your enemy exactly what they want. It makes you look completely out of control while they get to sit back and play the innocent victim for the crowd. Instead, I want you to plant your heavy boots firmly on the ground. Take a deep, steady breath and aggressively protect your inner peace. Let them do all the arrogant talking. Let them boast and brag and slowly dig their own permanent graves with their unchecked pride. Your only job is to stay quiet, stay invisible, and observe every single detail. Gather your facts meticulously. Collect the undeniable physical evidence piece by piece in the dark while they are busy celebrating their lies. Build a concrete foundation of absolute truth so incredibly solid that no amount of expensive corporate lawyers or elite high society connections can ever knock it down. And when the perfect moment finally arrives, you will not even need to raise your voice. You just open the heavy door, step out of the shadows, and let the cold, hard truth do all the heavy lifting. The truth is an unstoppable force of nature, and it will absolutely crush any deceptive empire built on stolen ground. Now, if this father's journey struck a chord with your spirit today, I would deeply appreciate it if you could do me a small personal favor. Hit that like button right down there to bring a little warm sunshine to this retired electrician's heart. It means the absolute world to me knowing that my lived experiences are resonating with good, hard-working folks who truly understand the immense value of family and unshakable integrity. Please go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next life stories I am preparing to share with you. We are building a truly wonderful, supportive community here, and I want you to be a part of it every single step of the way. And before you click away, please drop a quick comment down below. Tell me exactly what beautiful city you are watching from, and what time it is right now in your neck of the woods. I sit out on my back porch with my morning coffee, and I read every single one of those comments. It brings me immense, genuine joy to see how far my words are landing across the country and around the globe, connecting all of us through these shared trials and ultimate triumphs. Keep your loved ones close and keep your eyes wide open. Stay blessed, stay incredibly vigilant, and I will see you all in the very next story.